Bronwyn, welcome to the MindShift podcast. How are we doing?
Excellent. Thank you so much for inviting me.
No, it's this one has been, it's funny when I get the guests on, I'm always like, oh, it's a long time coming. But this one really has. I've been stalking you probably in a really unhealthy way for for a long time. So yeah, I'm really happy to have you on. But before we get into who you are and what you do, I guess I always ask my guests to come up with a log line, a summary of who they are. What would yours be?
Well, I'm a futurist for money and an economist for fun.
Oh, okay. I love that. We're going to dig into that a little bit more a little bit later on. Um, Before I get into it, I tend to ask my guests to pick a number between 1 and 12, and the number links to what I call a killer question, and then we'll ask it a little bit later on. So, what number would you pick from 1 to 12?
Number 12,
Number 12, of course, why not?
biggest number.
Okay. So the question you've picked, which we'll come back to a little bit later on, is if you were braver, what would you be doing in your life right now? Okay, so we'll come back to that. But I guess yes, Bronwyn. So tell me a little bit about you. I guess some of my listeners may never have come across you, or this might be the first time they're hearing you. Maybe give us a bit of a whistle stop tour of your career. I guess.
Yeah, so as I said in the sort of log line, I am paid to talk about the future, which basically means I have the best job or not job in the world, and that we essentially get to read up on interesting things and then talk about it for a living, which is fantastic. What it essentially means is that we're kind of in our industry the contemporary equivalent of the court jester. We get to jingle our bells in the halls of power and privilege, and sometimes we even get to sneak in some wisdom and some sense. Hopefully, if we're doing it right, amongst the jokes and the eye rolls about all the exciting things that are the future. But anyway, how I ended up there is because, well, I'm kind of unemployable in a real job, which happens when you have a bit of an eclectic career to start out on. That's what they don't tell you when you sort of finish school and try to get your first job. Really does matter, because if you don't get a proper job that fits you into a nice career rung ladder, you're going to end up doing some pretty strange things with some pretty strange people, which I highly recommend, by the way. Incidentally, the least safe space you can be these days is actually in a 9 to 5 job, where you think that you've given up all sorts of freedom for all sorts of security, but as in always is the case when it comes to trade-offs between freedom and security, you never actually get security. You just get the illusion of security in exchange for the various freedoms that you give up. And that's probably been one of the recurring themes of my life. When it comes to values should have a price, and I have certainly paid the price to err on the side of freedoms in a very sort of physical sense, but also in quite a physical sense too. Again, highly recommend it. But how I ended up here, essentially, if you want this sort of quick origin story, is when I was in primary school, when I was in grade 4, as they would call it to these days, at least in South Africa, where I'm from, I had a teacher called Mrs. Reed who told us to read. She just straight up bribed us. She was like, I'll buy you a milkshake at the favorite ice cream parlor if you read 50 books throughout the course of the year. And I was highly impressionable and highly reward motivated. So I did that. And the problem is that, much like in The Lord of the Rings with the dwarves who delve too deeply and too darkly, once you start to read too widely and too deeply, you do become a challenge to any sort of authority. So she definitely set me off on a path of completely the wrong path for a nice little girl, right? So that's the problem with reading, with collecting ideas. You get ideas, right? And they're not always ideas that make people comfortable. And I've been fortunate enough through the various things that I've studied. Started off studying classic sort of business management. Since then, I've studied everything from theology to design to future studies and philosophy. So again, I've just gone wider and wider, become more and more unwieldy, and become someone that has the ability to give context to my clients, to connect dots and find patterns and spot clues that perhaps they wouldn't have picked up for themselves. But anyway, the sort of career to futurist, you don't just get to become a futurist when you're like 14, whatever the sort of the young generation alpha futurists want to call themselves. You have to have a bit of grounding in the past. You have to have a bit of experience. And fortunately, I've had that both in the entrepreneurial sense and the employment sense, working in marketing and selling other people's products and ideas, and then also slowly developing my own so that we can start to sell those too. So my journey was from selling of other people's ideas, marketing, into trend research, which is still quite retrospective looking, and then moving into the world of futures, so sort of looking ahead. So the dots connect quite nicely there.
Nice, nice. Thank you. There's so much I want to kind of needle into, and I think one of the reasons why I was probably more naturally attracted to you and your profile was because there's a lot which I can relate to on the fact of I don't fit a mold. And often I find myself pissing people off a little bit because I'm like, no, you talk about bullshit jobs or whatever. I'm like, and it becomes this thing where either people love it or they hate it. It feels a bit Marmite. We have this kind of term of it, Marmite. Again, I'm assuming you don't have Marmite, but you probably do.
Above all.
Um,
Yeah, so yes,
yes,
Marmite
yes.
is there's usually a fight between the two too. So yes, totally
It's
understand
a real dust up, real dust up. But I want to go right back to your childhood a little bit. I guess you talked about your teacher bribing you to read and stuff like that. Um, was there anything when you was a child? What did you want to be when you grew up at that time? Like, was there anything specific?
Have you been reading some of my older essays, the slightly embarrassing ones? Maybe,
Maybe.
maybe not. No, I wanted to be two things. I wanted to be a rock star and I wanted to be a spy. I wanted to be James Bond, basically. That's what I wanted. So,
Okay.
in a manner of speaking, I kind of get to do those, at least the Tim Ferriss sense, the man who wrote the 4-day work week that's now become like a total international movement. His whole book was about the technical win, right? And I think that I have taken on board perhaps some of that wisdom too, in that I do get to stand on a stage for a living and sometimes get to crack jokes and have the lights in my face. So almost a rock star. And as far as the sort of spy thing goes, I mean, that's what we do. We're like professional outside observers, right? In this world of trend and futures. So in a technical sense, I suppose I've still got some of that, but sadly, the glamour is not quite lived up to my original expectations.
Nice. It's funny. So I wrote a book, and I want to get into your book a little bit later on as well because it is up there with maybe my top 5 books, and I'm similar to you. I read a lot. But in my book, there was a bit which I pulled out of the book, which was talking about observation future trends because I'm not really an expert in it. I would love to be. I would literally love to be. But there's a trait there which is observing patterns, like say, and connected dots. And something I've always wanted to be is what I've always enjoyed when doing working with large organizations to help them fix their employee experience and whatever else is observing people and just being generally a little bit nosy, right? Like just being able to observe. Is that a trait you have? Like, is it a trait you have, or do you like to go even bigger and observe even bigger patterns?
Well, I think it's just a general insatiable curiosity about everything, and that's the thing. And particularly, what's drawn me to the field of futures is because it is literally everything. Like you start off being interested in one small slice of something, and as you start to pull on those threads, you start to see how absolutely everything is connected, and how deep so many of those patterns go. Those patterns might seem quite superficial, or little clues or signals of change today map onto much greater patterns that aren't going really anyway. So I think that if you are curious, you start to see pretty quickly that everything is connected, and that futures is a nice space to play in because it's sort of the broadest of all those lenses, right? So it's the absolute opposite of being a specialist in everything. It's a very generalist field, which suits someone like myself who is constantly interested in something new and gets bored with old ideas quite quickly.
Oh, I agree. I agree massively. I think I can't wait to actually. This is one of them weird podcasts where I really care about you, but I want to get into the good stuff a little bit later on. But I'm sticking with you a little bit first. Um,
It's your show.
you strike me as someone who's quite fun, quite enjoyable, high energy, and a rock star element. Can you tell me the first time you remember getting in trouble as a child?
I was constantly in trouble at home, but I was never in trouble at school. That's the thing. I mean, you say I come across as quite enjoyable. It's entirely false advertising. I'm awful. I'm dreadful in person, right? So the professional and the personal is very different. But I was constantly in trouble at home because I was the eldest, and being the eldest daughter, that just means basically you are cast to be the villain in your mother's story for at least the first 18 years of your life, right? I was usually in trouble with my sisters, and usually
Okay.
usually because that's the role of the eldest daughter, is to take the pain from the parents. I mean, the memes on like Twitter and Instagram and TikTok are perfect there. The cliches between the various different roles in families, it's spot on. But usually I'd get in trouble because my sister would do something and then she'd lie about it, and she was much cuter than I was. So I'd get in trouble for trying to defend myself with my big mouth, right? She didn't learn how to keep quiet. That was the
Um,
I never got in trouble at school. I was always much more smart with being rebellious there. I was
mm,
clearly not. I think I gave my teachers quite a lot of trouble because I got very good marks and I didn't do anything technically wrong, but they could tell that I disrespected them from the way that I looked at them. The topics I chose what to write. I know, I gave them huge amounts of discomfort. My presence was disconcerting, and I think that that is something I've taken with me. This innate desire to challenge and to discomfort authority figures, which is not great for my the fortune part of my fame and fortune quest. I mean, there's as my one of my very good friends who works in a similar space to me says, good prophets don't get invited back to dinner twice because they've made everyone very uncomfortable the first time around. So that's a constant threat throughout my life. And I don't think anyone that's actually met me in person would disagree with that.
I think there's something nicer around challenging the norms, right? Having a healthy disrespect for the norms and the things what we see in, like, whether it be society in school and just, yeah, I think there's a healthy there's a rebellious inside of you, I guess,
Yeah,
like that in the rebellion.
it's a subtle rather than an overt rebellion, right? So
Mm,
it's this fact that we actually don't have to respect anyone in positions of authority. Which, if you're getting back to the book that Theo and I put together, was one of the key themes there. Is this idea that authority, fame, position, privilege. I don't see any reason why we should have to respect these things out the gate just because everybody else does too. Also don't understand why you got to respect brand names. I remember like actually cutting the brand names off my clothing as a teenager when everyone else was spending more money to be seen wearing them. I was like, I don't conform to this
mm.
buying into other people's ideals. Very strange. I mean, like looking back, like that's a good thing. That sums it up.
But yeah, there's something around kind of, Carl Jung's work, which is we wear masks. We wear different masks depending on who we are. And you kind of already alluded to it. You've got the mask of professional you and then the personal you and the one in school. I guess who was your biggest influence then as a child, maybe a teenager? Like, who was the biggest influences who maybe shaped you into who you are today, I guess?
Well, there's only one person that did that. So, I mean, like my intellectual and attitude and general sort of take on the world, which is we don't have to take this too seriously to quote someone who you're not supposed to quote on these shows. But that's a separate side point for those who want to pick up on that Easter egg. But no, I was my brain was very much raised by Terry Pratchett. I would say that's probably all you need to know.
Okay, I mean, that right there is good
Well, I'll
insight.
tell you how I got to know him too. I mean, this point that I completely made teachers very uncomfortable. That was when I was 11 years old, and the English teacher was frightened of me. And she didn't know what to do with me because I looked at her like she was an idiot because she was a little bit. She was an art teacher and she was teaching English and she just wasn't very bright. And she could tell that I knew that about her. And she was frightened of me and she didn't want me criticizing her lectures or like putting my hand up and telling and asking her questions she didn't know how to answer. So she said, I think that you don't need to do this lesson. You seem like you know what I'm talking about. So read this in the back. And she gave me Lords and Ladies, which is one of the middle Discworld books from the Pratchett collection, and told me to go read that when I was in her class rather than being in the class. So 11-year-old me got thrown in the deep end there. Again, these teachers, they cause all sorts of trouble for the world without necessarily intending to.
It's true. It's so true. It's so true. And just listening there, when I was in school, so I'm 40. So I mean, I'm going back some now, but in school, I got I was informed, let's say, at about 20, 25 when I was in uni. I was dyslexic and dyspraxic, and throughout whole school, it never got flagged up. However, I had two teachers what I still remember to this day. I had Mrs. Tucker and Mr. Chadwick. And Mrs. Tucker was my English teacher. And she could see that obviously my reading wasn't great, but she created a safe space for me to be curious and dig in and read randomness. And then the other person, Mr. Chadwick, let's call him, um, he stood me up in a class when we was doing algebra. And when I said, I don't understand it, the words are moving, I don't get it, he told me that I was dumb and thick. And to this day, I'm 49. I still remember these two different teachers giving me two different experiences of school, and it's not really an impact. It's something I can reflect on now. Um, but yeah, it's funny, right? It's funny how a teacher can have this amazing impact or this Not some amazing impact, I guess.
Yeah, especially
Thinking, yeah.
in these sorts of cases where the teachers weren't necessarily good teachers. It just happened to do something that like allowed you to follow your own curiosity, which is I think one of the other critical lessons that I would definitely give to anyone. I mean, like I'm also getting a bit on. I'm not that different in age to you. I'm of the same vintage as the Back to the Future movie, which is apt for the course of my life. If you want to want to retrofit that, we're a great batch, especially in the futures field. There's quite a lot of us from around that era.
Yeah, yeah, but why is that? Like, obviously, you've got stimulus coming from like Back to the Future. You've got all these cool films. Weird Science is another great movie which I personally enjoyed. But yeah, like I think I look at, we talk about people and their careers, and we talk about career paths, and I guess the way I kind of describe my career path, which I don't have, is it's more like crazy paving rather than linear. It's like it's all over the show. And I think there's something around the era in which we grew up, the stimulus we had, and we knew a world before deep tech, like iPhones and whatever else, and we know a world with it. Do you think that has an impact on us as a, and I want to say generation, but whatever you want to call it, like the reason why we think and why our work ethic is different, or is that something,
Yeah,
am I making that
like
up?
I'm quite a big believer in terms of futures and trends. Trends are obviously backwards looking, much like whether you're looking at economic trends or social trends, you're looking at past data points that have incidence in space and time, whereas futures are sort of going off and sort of speculating that what comes next. But I would very much say that a lot of my work does rely on the theories of generational theory and like the fourth turning theory. It makes a lot of sense. We've had these sort of adages throughout history from like the pre-print days. People understand that history turns in cycles, that history doesn't repeat, but it's got a mighty good rhythm section, and that things do go in patterns, whether you're talking about weather patterns and El Nino and La Nina, or whether you're talking about how different generations react to the world around them, whether you're born into periods of prosperity or periods of high expectation and low reality, or vice versa, low expectation and high reality. You have fundamentally different ways of looking at the world. Okay, I was born into the 80s, right? I was born into the 80s, which was one of those sort of, at one of those periods, it was a tipping point for the whole world, but never mind for the world, for South Africa in particular. I still remember like my parents calling me and my sisters, or my one sister, she was pregnant with the other one at the time, into our room and saying, well, there might be a civil war. People might want to kill you because of the color of your skin. It could go full Gaza, like what's going on in the world. And we were like, we're like, this is when you're like 5, 6 years old. And so there was this sort of constant sense of dread, but also then excitement that there's change and the change is going to be good. And remember, this is the same period, this is going down in South Africa, and sort of 5-year-old me is being told by my parents how to duck, run, and cover in like Johannesburg suburbia in South Africa. You've also got the Berlin Wall coming down, right? And you've got all this massive change and going on across the world, the sense of potential, but also the sense of inclement danger. Things can go either way, and those sorts of things seep into your little consciousness when you are small, and does shape how you see the world going forward. The 80s was all about big. It was about big expectations. It was about like a suppressed dread too. I mean, you had like the AIDS epidemic again that played out very
Mm.
differently in the rest of the West compared to like what happened in South Africa. But there was the sense of dread and poison, but also the sense of expectation and a sense of you can grab what's yours. So yes, we were the sort of cusp-like generation. I think it was a particularly interesting place as well as time to be born and to have those sort of formative ideas about the world sort of seep into you. And I can see the difference between my daughter, who would be in what they classify like Generation Alpha at the moment, and like her generation. Those sort of formative years were spent literally in lockdown, wearing masks, not being able to see their friends. But also, their generation has grown up with a distrust of authority as much as they've been grown up with deference to authority, and that even children are not stupid enough to know that it's daft to be forced to wear a mask for 8 hours at school,
Mm.
but then to take it off for an hour over lunch. Like even a 4-year-old asks you questions about that you can't quite answer. So this generation is going to challenge authority in all sorts of different ways, but they've been like a generation that's like come with oppression, that's going to have to figure out what to do with themselves, and that's quite interesting. But anyway, the whole sort of generational cycles that talk about boom and bust cycles, that talk about strong men making good worlds that get inherited by more entitled generations, and then have to deal with the mess that comes with those cycles, are quite informative. And many futurists have looked at different cycles, whether you've looked at the cycles of when wars take place, which also tends to take place on a sort of on a massive global scale, on a sort of 60 to 80-year cycle. This is generational. There's reasons for it. It's because when we forget about suffering in practice, it starts to become tempting in theory, right? And like that's a sort of a civilizational sort of level. But at a corporate level too, the same sorts of things happen. These cycles of plenty and scarcity are constantly rolling forward. And the sort of stock market cycles are remarkably prescient in how you can sort of decide when to buy high and when to sell low, right? If you start to look and understand the cycles of fear and greed and how those sorts of things turn. And there's great literature on that in sort of narrative economic sense. But anyway, look at the cycles. And yes, I do think the future is something that called to us elder millennials, as they call us, the ones that were old enough to just have heard on the news
Mm.
about the Berlin Wall and everything else that was going on at that pivotal time with the clash of civilizations, right? And also the sorts of parents that we grew up with and the sorts of sense of expectation that was definitely one of the
Mm.
key features of our generation, was a sense of great expectation but poorer reality. So we are a generationally disappointed cohort of humanity. And I think that that's sort of that pushes us to looking to the future. And I think that if you've spoken to Theo Priestley, who co-wrote The Future Starts Now with me, he's done some other stuff with me too, but he will speak about that quite a lot too, that perhaps the downside of our generation was looking towards the sense of what they call it like postalgia, or the sense of lost future. And how it's also interesting to see how it's like the opposite of nostalgia. So instead of hankering after a past you can't go back to, it's hankering after a future you'll never get to. Like that it's never
Ah.
quite gonna kind of get to it. And that's also interesting to see how that's played out differently with the generations sort of between us and like my child, that sort of mid-generation, what they're calling now like the Generation Zs, or as we call them in South Africa, the born free generation, which was a very critical cohort. This was a generation that was born into post-apartheid South Africa. They were the first generation that was born at least theoretically equal, right? And like that's the great thing about South Africa. We just made explicit all the terrible injustices that the rest of the world just didn't name, right? So we're a great
Mm.
case study into seeing how that plays out. And if our generation had the sense of sort of postalgia and like this failed expectation, this is a generation who has, in their formative years, they saw 9/11 take place. They've been brought up with fear. They've graduated into lockdown, COVID, helicopter money world. And this is a generation caught between anarchy and apathy, which is like also very, very interesting to see how that plays out, and how all those decisions, once you sort of understand those generational mindsets and those differences between expectation, reality, and happiness and settlements, and what drives you forward and what pulls you back, you can start to make pretty accurate predictions about what's going to happen with things like politics and like wars and like the economy, because that's the other sort of big thesis that I have. And that's something that happens when you get like too much education in economics. I've got a master's degree. I'm trying to do a PhD now too, which is stupid and ridiculous, but I can't help myself. Anyway, just for fun, right? So like coming back to the
Why not?
byline. But the key thing that ties like economics and futures together is economics is like trends, backwards looking data. Futures is forward looking. But there is this, what sort of ties those two worlds together is our expectations create our reality. And my favorite
Mm.
example there, that just gets the point across really, really quickly, is the great sort of toilet paper crisis of the year 2020, right? When we willed ourselves into a toilet paper crisis when there was absolutely none. People were still making toilet paper, but the shelves were bare because we all acted in expectation there'd be a shortage and created a shortage. Same thing with the eggs this year. Very similar, right? It's all our own behavior. Our expectations create our reality because they change our behavior. They change what we invest in, where we pay our attention to, and that's how the future unrolls. Expectation from expectation, or as to put the same points in a way that sounds more intellectual, the future is generally built by dead economists and the ideas that they plant, right? Because we start to believe in them and then we start to act towards them, which is why I love the lens of economics as a way to sort of just bend those trends into the future and start to see things.
Nice. I love the just as you were speaking there, there's two kind of key things which were coming out. I mean, there was lots, and this is gonna be one of the podcasts where I'm gonna have to listen back to and be like, scribbling notes. I know it straight away. Um, but that kind of anarchy and apathy, like that melting pot, what that's going to look like is quite interesting. Um, and you use the analogy, and I think we're talking about the same thing, but it's that kind of hard times make hard men make soft times make soft men. And I use this with my nephews at the moment, so they're just hitting going into working world now. And I'm like, oh, you don't know how easy you've had it. That and I find myself saying that, and I'm like, oh my days, I'm turning into my parents. Um,
Mm.
but but I think there's something around there's not something around dragging them into the past to see the future, but there's something around reminding them, like what's got them into this space where you have this abundance of knowledge at the kind of tips of your fingers. Like there's something around reminding them, but not forcing them to be in the past so much. I don't know. What do you think?
It's not dragging people back to the past. It's orientating ourselves in space
Mm,
and time, which is the way I like to say it. I mean, this is like where the science fiction ideas come from. It's the space time continuum. You are part of a story, and you are part of a geography too. There's time and space, and you have to orientate yourself within that to make sense of where you are. And what we've done very well over our generation, our very disillusioned millennial generation, has bought in wholly into the being trapped in the infinite now, right? You know, the future's not working out the way we planned. The past is depressing because it's better than the present, and you kind of get stuck in the sort of island of the present, and that's quite dangerous. That's also where these ideas of where the following generations are also kind of getting stuck in these sort of spaces of anarchy and apathy, which are reactions to nihilism, which is again a disconnection from having a purpose, or having or understanding that you are part of a story and part of a space too, right? You know, like that's those are the whole sort of Shakespearean ideas of being players on a stage, which can be taken to be quite frivolous, but it can also be taken to be quite serious, right? You are part of a story that is unfolding, and you have agency to act on that, but you don't understand your character until you understand the backstory, until you understand how it is that we got here, or where it is that we want to be going, right? Or how it is that you relate to the other characters on the stage. And we have done a very good job through our technology of distracting ourselves into away from space and time, sort of isolating ourselves into a place of surrounding ourselves with, like you were saying before we started the show, like avatars and characters of people, turning real people into NPCs, if you want to put it that way. It's not the other way around, right? It's not like they started out as NPCs. We managed to isolate ourselves from other people and to disconnect ourselves from the story, disconnect ourselves from people living in the same timelines as us, which is why we can abstract the horrors of war that are going on at the moment, and why we're so bloodthirsty and why so many people are calling for wars is because we've dehumanized everyone else around us. We've disconnected from space, but we've also disconnected ourselves from time. So you don't have a purpose. And when you sort of cut those threads of history and future, you really are disconnected. And then anarchy and apathy make total sense, right? Because you
mm,
don't have that space. So you've got to kind of rebuild those connections. The other thing I keep on coming back to is only connect, right? You got to connect. You got to connect with your past. You got to connect with your future, and you got to connect with your space around you if you want to feel like you're part of something and not just a passive spectator, which I think a lot of people feel at the moment.
yeah, yeah. It feels like the kind of show's being done around him rather than being an active actor within
Like
that
everyone
show.
else is acting, so therefore I am too. And then you start
Yeah.
into the character that you're acting into, and you sort of believe that that is who you are. It's very interesting.
So I'm going to take you from the past into today. Um, and I guess if you had a treasure chest, okay, and within this treasure chest, you can put a memory in there and you can keep going back to that memory and reliving it. What one memory would you put in? And I'm going to put a clause on it. And it can't be having children.
Oh yeah, no, I wouldn't choose that.
Okay, that's good then.
I don't know. I don't know if I would put a memory in a box that I'd want to keep on going back to. And I don't think you can either, because every time you revisit one of those sort of memories, it's like a little bit rubs off and a little bit rubs on, and like that object changes as you go through. But I'm not sure I'd choose really anything. I hope there's something better that's going to come along that I can put in that box. That was a terrible way to answer your question, but yeah, I got nothing.
No, that's a it's a great one. And kind of it moves me on to one of your signals. So for them who don't know, you do a daily signal, which we'll dig into a little bit more. But there was one what I watched recently, which was around memories, removing of memories, digital memories. I think again, I was watching this at 4 o'clock in the morning, so forgive me if I don't do it justice. But maybe share a little bit about that, the kind of fact that these memories can now you can just wipe them. I guess.
Yeah, I mean, like there's so many ways that we can remove our sort of digital footprints and everything, but there's a lot going in there, and I think that a lot of that is to do with digital fragility is like a term that was going on around a lot of it. Like if we start to digitize our memories, those memories can be changed and they can be removed, and it means that we can't really go back to them, right? But there's also this sort of sense that we have with our digital connected lives that once you've digitized something, we no longer have to think about it. So it's no longer part of us, it's now part of the machine, right? But because of that, they become more and more fragile and more susceptible to being quite literally overwritten, right? And we see that a lot. And that's also coming back to this idea of disconnection through sort of space and time. You become disconnected from your own memories.
Hmm. It, and I think there's something around, removing that digital footprint. And I guess the best way I kind of see it is at the moment is when I was younger. Again, take us back to when I was a young child. My mum used to be able to show me these photo books. Here's you on the Christmas day. Here's you, your grandparents. Like there was real life photos. There's something tactical about it. And I think with the introduction of, and again this isn't new, but you've got the things of cloud now and Google Photos where everything's uploaded and you never really reflect back on these pictures. And I find when I look at two pictures now, when I look at a physical version and a digital version, the emotion what pulls from that is often more impactful with the physical version. It's more there's a nostalgia to it, I guess, which is lackluster now in this digital picture world. I don't know. Do you find that, or is it just me being over emotional?
No, there's quite good neuroscience to that, right? Like anything tactile, anything that involves more than one of your senses or more than two of your senses is going to have a deeper connection to your brain and be more retrievable, right? I mean, this is why memories attached to scent are much stronger than memories that are just something
Mm.
we watched on a screen. It's why we struggle with loneliness even when we are able to now talk to Granny on the video phone, but Granny is more lonely now than she was when you only wrote her a letter that came through the post, like she got every 3 or 4 months, because it doesn't feel real. We don't get that sort of actual satisfaction from this thing, from this connection. And because I think at a much deeper, quite psychological kind of lizard brain kind of level, we don't believe anything digital because we shouldn't believe anything digital. And this is an argument I've had with lots of friends being involved with the whole sort of crypto space for like a very long time before it was cool. There are these ideas that this idea of digital equals immutable truth equals proof. And again, we have wars going on in the world right now, and everyone's got a story, everyone's got a piece of footage to back up their view of whatever atrocity took place yesterday. And it's all true, but it's not true because nothing digital is proof because it can all be manipulated. I mean, like not even the footage of people going to the moon can be used as proof that people went to the moon. If you want proof that people went to the moon, you got to go look at the money that was spent and the things that were made and go look at the rocket ship and speak to the people who went there. You're not going to, it doesn't prove it. A bit of grainy footage doesn't prove that that happened. And we want to sort of, there's the sense of wanting to outsource the validation of who we trust and what we believe in to something else, whether it is a machine, whether it is digital footage, whether it is whatever, whether it's a personal memory that we've now digitized, we've now sort of abstracted and locked away and made it true. But it doesn't make it true. It is by definition flattened already, and anything has to get into the system somehow, whether it's through a lens that is cropping an image in a certain way, whether it's through different choices. It's not truth just because it's we can see it, it doesn't mean that it's actually true. And that applies to memory, but it also applies to sort of general consensus and truth. And I think that's something a lot of people are debating at the moment. And I think they've probably got the wrong idea. People are like, we don't have any common shared sense anymore, any common shared reality. Well, we do. We have common shared reality if the sun comes up in the morning. You're allowed to deny that, but I mean, it's still going to be there, right? Same with like the flat earth thing, right? You can that's something we can prove because we can go walk around it and fly around it ourselves. It might take you your whole life, but you can figure this out. There is shared truth, but there's no shared truth to be found on a social media platform, through a journalist article, or through anything that is outside of ourselves. Like that's what science is really all about. It's about doing experiments, not about reading the results of other people's experiments, right? Which is what we're trying to do. But it really comes down to this deeper idea of us wanting to outsource truth, reality, feelings, what we're supposed to feel, what we're supposed to see, what we're supposed to know, to someone else, because it again feels safer to have someone else determine that consensus for us, so we don't have to trust ourselves to make the right judgment
Mm.
calls, to use judgment, to use agency. It's so much easier to try and outsource that. Then we get very disappointed when all of those systems prove to be failable because they cannot do what they're promising to do. Just like giving up your freedom will never give you safety. It can only give you the promise of safety. It can make you
Mm.
feel safe, but it can't make you safe. And it's the same sort of thing we've seen with increasing calls for governance. Like, govern us harder. Like, we're not responsible enough for this thing called the internet, this thing called AI. But you've still got to trust that the governance is going to be better and not worse, right? There's still trust you have to put into the system. You cannot, and there's still trust, there's still agency, there's still choice, and there's still your judgment that you have to come back to. These are not things that you can reliably outsource. I think that's
Mm.
a lot of the thesis towards a lot of the stuff that I talk about, which is the point of why do people engage with futures people? It's because we're there to help you make better decisions and to claw back agency so that you're not just sort of drifting along to the future, that you're actually sort of part of it. So it's much less about predicting what's going to happen, unless you're using that prediction in the sense that a prophet would use the prediction in order to catalyze action to say, hey, we don't actually want to go there. Prefer to go somewhere else. We're like, yeah, if you don't want to head to where I've shown you where you're going, then you're going to have to do something. It's about giving people back the mandate, the responsibility, and then the responsibility to use that agency to move forward. So yeah, that's
So, but where does that? No, no, no. This is awesome. I like, and I guess it for me, it kind of gets me thinking about about ladder of abstraction, right? The further you go up the ladder, the bigger the abstraction. The further you come down the ladder, the more tactical. And and I kind of start thinking, are people offloading the trust to this digital world? Isn't because it's more around the bandwidth, right? Because if you're a person, and you go, okay, I need some structure in my life. People love structure, like, and you go, okay, well, I'll trust the narrative of the news or whoever, and they go up that. But it's because ultimately the circular problem is the further they go up the ladder to get this trust, the less they get it. It's like it feels like a real circular problem of, well, how do you turn this reality? How do you make this reality without, like you say, going around the world to show that the world is round? Like how do you do that? Where does someone go to kind of add that rigor and point of truth into it? I don't know.
portals all the way down when you try to prove anything to yourself. So the point is you have to start to make judgment calls. You have to choose what you're actually going to believe in, but you also have to take responsibility that that's your choice, right? Like, you might have to, you might just choose to base the way you work your logic up. You try to use first principles like the rationalists do, but even so, there's always a principle below the principle below the principle, which was where the old, like, the likes of Russell and co got all twisted into knots in the early 20th century, when they figured out there was no floor below the ground, right? That it just kept on going down. But sooner or later, you have to make an assumption, you have to make a choice, and you have to start building from that, right? But you also have to admit that that's a choice that you've made. And when you find out that you've built on the wrong floor, at the wrong level, you can't really blame the person whose judgment you chose, right? Because that was a choice. That
Yeah.
was a choice to choose to come in at that level rather than to figure things out for yourself. But yeah, you still have to make a choice. You still have to move forward, and you still have to move forward within understanding that your assumptions are going to be flawed. There is no complete ground floor to the assumptions to which to build upon, and that you have to make decisions in the face of uncertainty. But the magic is, if you make decisions, you get an outsized vote into what you actually going to get. That's the sort of
Mm.
secret to pragmatic optimism, which becomes that moral duty when you understand that expectations change reality, right? So it's when you making that choice, you have an outsized opportunity and an outsized probability that you're going to get what you are acting towards. And that's a huge amount of responsibility. But again, responsibility is not a popular thing. Neither is optimism. Both will get you crucified these days. But it's generally to understand what you're actually talking about. It's not about hope. Had this argument with like idiot futurists on LinkedIn. There are a lot of idiot futurists on LinkedIn. I'm sorry, guys. Like, we're not. It's embarrassing. So I noticed my cooler, more reputable futurist friends are now calling themselves futurologists to sort of distance themselves from the fray. But they're like, oh no, hope is stupid because we're all going to die from climate change. I'm like, no, then you're the idiot, because actually what we need is optimism, which is different to hope. Hope is sitting around praying to your God or sort of sucking your thumb and wishing things are going to get better. Whereas actual optimism is optimism backed by action, which gets you more of what you want as opposed to less of what you want, which is the sort of the opposite side of that, if that makes any sense.
No, it definitely does. I love the fact that you kind of needled in on experimentation. So I bang on about experimentation a lot, and I talk about actually the real value of experimentation is in the learning. It's not as in whether it's successful or not. It's in the learning as to why it was successful or why it failed. Um, but there's something around which you kind of mentioned around being able to change your mind, and I think in this day and age we kind of get downvoted, if you like, or cancelled or whatever words you want to include, but like, oh, you've changed your mind. And you should be like, well, yeah, because I've got new insight and new data coming, which has gone, oh, maybe I was wrong. I've changed my mind and now it's this. But I guess, especially when I look at Twitter/X, it feels like you get exposed for changing your mind. Like, no, I'm allowed to change my mind. Do you want me to stick with a wrong opinion and continue banging that drum out? So like there's this kind of double-edged sword of the flexibility to change your mind because you should be able to always change your mind, but don't dare kind of put it out there socially because God forbid you're gonna get exposed for changing your mind. I don't know. It
Yeah,
feels like
or
it's
like
a
an apology for like figuring out something else to go on. No, that is
yeah.
a problem. And it's also like close to one of my like favorite sort of semantic arguments, this idea that, oh, we should be unlearning all the time, which is not that at all. It's like you only learn more. No one ever unlearns anything. You just learn more stuff and then you have a better decision making sort of toolkits with which to make decisions
Mm,
going forward tomorrow. So yeah, of course you're gonna be wrong. We're all wrong. There is no one's figured it all out. Like the book Gödel Escher Bach is great there. It's like there's no sort of bottom layer that we can unpick fundamental, even mathematics or science towards, because it starts with an assumption. And you have to make that assumption. You have to understand it is going to be an assumption, and there's probably going to be something wrong, but there's probably enough rights that we can start to build something with, because that's the other thing. And I think that that's probably a bigger issue, the issue of paralysis, because we don't want to do anything until we're certain. And that I think
mm,
is more dangerous. And I think that's part of the same issue of relying on other people or systems or the code, or whether it's blockchain or AI, which is basically the same thing. It's basically a computer telling you what is true and what is not, so you don't have to make that judgment for yourself. Like that becomes a bigger issue when you're sort of waiting for that before you actually get anything done. Like you have to make a
mm.
choice. You have to decide what is true enough in this case, what is enough to move forward with and to actually do something with it. As I said, the sort of magic of maths and numbers and just the sheer amounts of people that understand that doing nothing is easier than doing something means that if you do something, even if your assumptions are not perfect and they are quite flawed, you're still going to end up vastly better off than someone that does nothing at all.
So then I guess I want to get us into the book, into kind of everything what you're doing, because for me, as much as this is exciting, like the stuff what you share is super exciting as well. And I know there'll be a lot of my listeners who will be like, I want to be like you. Like I know for a fact there's going to be. I personally am there. I'm like, yeah, I want to be like Bronwyn. Of course I do. Like this is awesome. Um, but before I get there, I want to ask you some probably quite abstract questions. But like, how long is it before AI is a god? And what I mean by that is, gods, make believes, myths, Greek legends, whatever else. Like, how long before we start to see AI being that for people?
Well, I'd say it already is, because our response towards the thing, not the thing being omniscient or omnipotent or anything, but it's us believing it is. Again, our expectations create our reality. So if you are deferring to AI to make any decisions, whether it's who you date because you're swiping on Tinder and they're telling you who you're allowed to collect with or not, or whether it is using an AI tool to decide where you're going to go next or what you're going to research on a much more practical level, the point is if you're already deferring to these systems as though they are omniscient and omnipotent, they become omniscient and omnipotent, right? Because they change your actions accordingly. And I think that for many people, in many cases, in both personal and professional life, I think that they're already there. That you can sort of take the mysticism out of it. And if you want to go for the mystical side too, I mean, there's plenty of strange, weird little case studies of AI Jesuses and all the rest of it that you can already get going. Or if you want to go over to Asia, I mean, you can hire robots to perform your religious rites for you if you want much more sort of literal interpretation of that question. But it's already there. It's just not evenly distributed, and it's very much a case of belief. Again, it's not a case of reality. It's not about the object, in this case, the AI, being godlike, or in any case, it's about us treating it as though it is. And I think in that
Mm.
that respect, I think the big tech companies have done a pretty good PR job of getting large amounts of the middle classes, or at least the intellectual middle classes, to buy into those ideas already, as you can see with the sort of general discourse around existential risk and all the rest of it.
Nice. Nice. So I'm going to spring off this question. So the book, everybody, you can see it. I really enjoyed this book, and I bought it when it very first came out. I know it's not brand new now, but I was just reading back through it. And I'm like, holy shit! Some of this is just still like it's still ahead, which is perfect for me, and probably for a lot of listeners. But there's a chapter which I really love, and I think it's actually the chapter that you wrote in defense of imperfect information.
Yeah, that was my one.
Yes, and there's a bit here which is called secret and lies, and I've got loads of scribbles on it. Because it again, it's me connecting my thought patterns to what you're writing here. And I kind of started thinking like it connected the secret and lies, and then the book Everybody Lies by the Google engineer, which is a great book. Um, but there's a bit here which is we all have secrets. I know I certainly do. Um, whether it be the kind of the closely guarded family recipe, or it's the stuff you don't want people to know, like how much you earn, how much you don't earn, and whatever else. So when we think about AI and gods, how long is it before them secrets become everybody else's data? Because we see it with ChatGPT, right? The information going in is used to be produce information coming out. Like, I don't know. I've got this idea going on in my mind around this marketplace of AI. We all create this AI assistant, and then it's a subscription model, right? You create one, and then I can subscribe to your AI model, and your learning becomes my learning. It's a monthly fee. I don't know. Um, but yeah, like how does that work? Because there's the AI, and then there's the secrets and the things you don't want people to know. How does that work? Because there's going to be a mix, right?
Yeah, well, it depends. It depends what you've sort of confessed to these sort of new gods, right? What you've put in order to get things out. Because all the information we put in, we generally giving it away because we want to get something exchanged. As much what the AI ethicists and the lamenting crowd, hand wringing crowds of the legions of the AI ethics community would say about big tech stealing our data and surveillance capitalism and all the rest of it. Well, our revealed preference is that we would like to get like things like social media for free. We would like to get better discounts for more, and we're quite happy to give away quite a lot of information in order to get that. Um, where it becomes interesting, though, is that we don't have to share anything with these systems, or we do have to share certain things. There's certain things that we can't like put the genie back in the box because the choice has been made by society rather than by individuals. Things like facial recognition and the whole Clearview drama that's going on at the moment. There's a book out at the moment, again, with the hand-wringing lamenting classes and your geolocation if you're using your phone. Like there are ways to avoid it, much like there was ways to avoid getting COVID by literally locking yourself in a basement and sterilizing your food. I mean, like you could have lived in a bubble. You could have done this, and you still can. You can decide to disconnect yourself altogether and literally live in like a Faraday cage. But you're going to miss out on a whole lot of things. There's that exchange there, and that's the sort of question as to what's worth giving up and what's not. But what I'm perhaps more interested in is the inaccurate secrets that get inferred, right? Because inferences are so interesting when it comes into these algorithms. Not much of it is actually based when it comes to you and I and our sort of profiles based on fact. It's based on inference. If you like this, then you'll like that, like the classic sort of Amazon algorithm. And a lot of the creepy stuff that people think that like Facebook is listening to your conversations, even though they swear they're not, quite a lot of that is because of who you were with rather than what you said, right? Like Facebook
Mm.
already knows your friend Jill really does like porcelain pigs, and you've spent the afternoon at her house and you might have been talking about her personal pigs, but Facebook hasn't seen that. But Facebook now knows you were in the room with Jill, which means like if she likes pigs, maybe you like pigs too, because she's explicitly sort of linked that, right? There's these ways that you sort of implicitly linked to people, but how that becomes broken telephone because it's imperfectly linked. And those sort of secrets that are inferred are not your real secrets, but they're secrets that become truth within the system because the system has decided that they are true. And they become self-reinforcing again because we're very reinforceable, very programmable creatures as people in terms of expectations become reality. Now it serves you more personal pigs, and quite soon you and Jill's personal pig club. Like this is just like what goes on. And that it's very strange how we get programmed by the machines that we program, and on we go. And there it becomes a case of how manipulated do you want to be, and how consciously do you want to be in control of your secret parts, right? How much do you want to deliberately withhold, and how much do you want to deliberately mislead by putting junk into the system, by clicking on links with things that you're not actually interested in order to trick machines, in order to sort of hide within the noise, which is like a common strategy to actually defend against surveillance regimes if you are an activist in a much more sort of practical, lived economy or political environment. So anyway, the whole idea of what's secrets, what's mis and disinformation, and who's providing it, whether it's coming from your customer, from the individual, whether it's coming from the sort of state or the surveillance capitalist, if you want to use that terrible phrase, coming back at you, and how all these things are interacting again. But I would say that even if we don't intend to keep secrets back, we're going to keep secrets back. Much like even if you pay a therapist to be your friend, don't get me started on the therapy and paid empathy industry, I'll be here all day. You're still not going to tell everything because you're dealing with something that you want to be seen in a certain way. So you're trying to program the person or the machine that you're responding to all the time. So a lot of those secrets are kept, if it's in your subconscious, which is where most of our secrets are, they're going to stay there. And they're going to be misconstrued and they're going to be misassumed, much like humans do with each other. Because
Mm.
we cannot digitize the entirety of us. We think we can do these things like map our connectomes and like upload our digital consciousness, but there's so much that we don't fully understand about the way we work and what nudges us and how our hormones work and our biomes. The fact there's more microbes in our body than there are sort of cells. I mean, it all gets very, very weird that we are these messy hunks of meat that contain secrets that are unknown even to ourselves. And we sort of have this huge hubris that we can unlock those secrets or digitize them just by either telling machines in order to get what we want, or have those things inferred by us. But it won't be inferred. There are going to be secrets. And again, the sort of illusion of safety is very similar to the illusion of total surveillance. This illusion of giving up so much because we think we're going to get what we want, but we're never going to get it because what we've given up is still inaccurate, it's still flawed, it still contains all those sort of discrepancies that can cause all sorts of chaos.
It's funny, right? I guess when you hear about, Ready Player One, the book, and then the later on movie, and you know, I have conversations all the time around people who want to move into kind of a metaverse and all this other jazz. I'm like, I find it a bit boring. That, to be honest, personal thing for me. Yeah, but
Okay.
but there's something around the more and more the physical and digital rub off on each other. The thing what makes us, the thing what will become valuable will be our secrets. It will be our human interactions. You look at a natural scale, right? You go from kind of raw commodities to products, from products to services, services to experiences. And I think ultimately you're going to move to time. There's a thing of actually the real commodity is the time, whether your time is saved or spent, like whatever it is. Um, but there's something around that kind of that human tension. And it links back to a little bit what you said earlier on. I did a talk a while back and I used scent bags, smell bags, which was all different scents from years ago. So it was like Play-Doh as a child and muscle rub and stuff like that to create stories. So I guess I want to understand a little bit about your story and share it in a way for my listeners. So, you know, whether you call it a futurist, futurologist, whatever, a lot of people don't know what that means. A lot of people are like, what the hell is that? It sounds cool. It sounds good. And Bronwyn's awesome, clearly. Um, but what does a day look like for you? Like, walk me through a typical day, what it looks like for you as a futurist, futurologist.
Yeah, sure. So essentially, what futurists do is we don't spend an awful lot of time predicting the future, although we do. That's how we get our names in the press releases, so we get work and attention and all the rest of it. What we really are in the business of is helping people to create their own futures, which is often actually being exactly opposite to what we're supposedly predicting. So the easiest way to sort of understand that is to see us kind of as grandiose as that sounds, as sort of the contemporary version of Old Testament prophets, right? Because the role of the prophet wasn't to predict that the rain of frogs was going to come on Tuesday. It was really to get people to change their ways so that the gods do not smote thee with the rain of frogs come Tuesday, right? So the prophet that does his or her job is preventing the predicted future from arriving, right? So actually inspiring a sort of difference there. So that's kind of what we do. So I have a small consultancy here in South Africa, although we do work all over the place across the MENA region. And my business partner and myself, as professional sort of prophets slash cage rattlers slash court jesters, what we generally do is get called in for quite short-term interventions with clients. As I said at the beginning of this thing, prophets don't generally tend to get invited back for tea more than once. So our interventions do tend to be quite short-term, unlike consultancies. We're not there to institute systems and processes and install software programs into your organization. Rather, generally, we're there to inspire change. So generally that takes place either through Depends what part of the organization we join into, and we're very much on the corporate side. Although I've done a little bit of government work, we much more in our agency because we are quite small in the corporate space. So our sort of general typical day would be either presenting keynotes on the future to boards or to companies, which is I think something that people are quite familiar with that futurists do at events. But the sort of actual work that pays our bills, when we called in for shorter term but still very time defined interventions, is to challenge people's thinking about the future and to kickstart change. So it's quite a change management, it's decision certainty and change
Mm.
management, getting people to understand the world so they can change the world. And we do that through workshops and trend reports. There's usually a process that we do where we produce a trend report that looks at a lot of, as you would have seen, the work we do, signals, compiles those into trends and where those signals can break and make those trends, so you understand the world. And then we do a workshopping process, which is what, again, your academic futurists, foresight practitioners, another word you'd hear there, the ones that don't give keynote speeches. We kind of do both. We're both futurists, yay, exciting, and foresight practitioners. We do the workshops, which are basically change management processes that take the understanding the world, trends and signals, and then basically workshop that into ways that you can influence your business strategy. So our sort of
Mm.
business, like literally byline, is trends as business strategy. So we'll explain trends that are going on and help you to use those trends to design your strategy, to either run along with those trends or to counter those trends and make some of your own, depending on your power and agency within your marketplace. And usually those workshops are quite based on the sort of management tools and models that they'll teach you when you do very expensive learning at university to become a professional futurist. They usually involve post-its or Miro boards,
Nice.
lots of cookies. There's a lot of that stuff going on, but all those tools and games are really designed to give people confidence in their own decision-making ability and to embed change management in organizations where employees or civil servants are very anti-change, because change is threatening. Change might mean losing your job, like we spoke about earlier. It's not a safe space to have a job these days. So a lot
Mm.
of our work is designed to get people bought into change. So hope that makes sense. So basically we do the features, keynotes, trend reports, shiny stuff. Like this is all these cool trends going on. And then the work is the more sort of foresight academic futures space, which is generally workshopping, usually within a sort of 1 day to maybe 3 month kind of a process. We are definitely best not embedded into organizations. We are professional outsiders. So we think
Nice.
for ourselves as like touring jesters, like I said before.
And what's the name? What's the name of your business?
Flux trends.
There we go. Yeah, I was just like, I won't say it. I'm gonna get Bronwyn to say it. But it's I like the idea of bringing that personality, right? Going, these are the big trends and what might happen and whatever else. There's an element of speculative design, I think, when I think about futurists and stuff like that. And I guess, there's probably people on there going, how do I start to be one? Like how be one? How do I start to be a futurist? How do I start to kind of use that mindset and skills? Like if you've got a couple of people, maybe they're in a career, they're new into their career, what tips would you give to people wanting to kind of, I'm not even going to say a career path because, like you say, it's connections and dots. Like, but what tips would you give to people who want to kind of go down that route?
Well, if you want the safe route, you can just go to academia. You can pay university lots and lots of money, like I did, and learn not very much, but you'll get a great piece of paper that gets you work, right? And gets you introduced to the nice NGOs and global bodies and governments that you need to pay for your academic funding. That's the honest truth. If you want to be, most professional futurists are essentially academics who have got the easy PhD. I mean, like,
Mm.
which is a terrible thing to say, but I mean, it really is an easy field to become an academic in. It's a popular career at the moment. Everybody wants a futurist. There's a lot of opportunities, a lot of grants, a lot of fellowships around the place. Go spend a fortune on doing a honors master's PhD at one of the many universities that now allow you to do that and be an academic futurist. But if you're interested in actually changing the world rather than interested in writing reports and sort of papers, maybe that's your thing. But if you're interested in actually changing people, you'll probably need to look at becoming a more independent futurist. Like there's a few of us across the world. We tend to be less respected by the academic faculty. Although I've got all the papers, right? You see, I'm like very stubborn. I get academic qualifications just so that I can criticize them from a position of
Mm,
power, not a position of weakness, right? You see, I've got a terrible ego, but there's not much. Honestly, I can't say that I learned much. I did get to read a lot of interesting papers when I did postgraduate future studies. Like, got to read a lot of interesting things, but I was already pretty well informed. I mean, I was someone that had read when I was a child 2-3 books a day, and I, as an adult, 2-3 books a week. I mean, you collect quite a lot of general knowledge, but it did introduce me to a lot of sources for certain sort of global trend reports that I wouldn't have thought about elsewise. But I could have found them out if I was just a bit more sort of persistent. That was the useful part of that. The part where you're useful to the world is when you are actually changing people's minds and giving people certainty, helping people understand the world, make decisions, and then change it in a way that makes sense. And that requires getting out there. It requires having a voice. It requires being that terrible thing, being a so-called thought leader, right? Because that's how you nudge the world, is by putting ideas out there and by challenging bad ideas and by posing new ideas and by causing trouble and getting people to think. And that's where
mm,
you can be the other sort of futurist, which requires absolutely no qualifications at all. Great ones there include the likes of like Nick Bagmington. No academic qualifications. He's an international futurist. He's flown all across the world. There's very similar things to what I do with all my little pieces of paper and certificates. But he gets to speak to the same boardrooms. He gets to speak at big events. He gets to speak at global platforms for political leaders and for business leaders, challenging ideas, simply being someone that's brave enough to have ideas that put a bit of sort of grit in the mill and get people thinking and driving and moving in a different direction. And that requires courage. It requires network. It requires getting out there and having an opinion. And that also means having a good sense of general knowledge. It's not something, if you're not well read, if you don't have a lot of insight to bring to the conversation, you should probably go the academic route, and you'll get to learn the frameworks that you can apply. You
mm,
can call yourself a futurist and do the workshops with people. You essentially end up being a facilitator or a researcher in that role. But if you want to do the sort of things that I'm talking about doing, you're going to have to get out there and build some sort of a reputation as being someone who is interesting, challenging, and uncomfortable, which means developing some sort of a platform, as we say, either writing, which is the classic way that people put ideas out there, whether you were Adam Smith or whether you were the biblical writers of the chapters of the holy books of the world. These are the people that changed the world because they got out there and they got their ideas down. You can write it, or you can be like the likes of like Socrates, who was like, I'm not going to write anything, I'm just going to talk about it and get other people to write it down. But still, you have to sort of put your ideas out there if you want to get anything done. So yeah, those are kind of your two paths, or you can do a bit of both, like I've done.
So for someone who's like, right, okay, so for example, a lot of my work is on the future of work, right? A lot of it is like, how do we create better people, products, experiences, and stuff like that. And a lot of my listeners are kind of CEOs, founders, heads of big bands, big pharma, whatever else. Um, but say they want to set up a team, other than getting you in, because I think everyone should get you in, like,
Totally.
honestly. Yeah, 100%. But say they've got someone who's got that appetite, that desire to want to go it alone, and like, where would they go? Would they go and look at like the trend watchers of this world? Like where would they go to kind of start forming their opinion? You know, because an opinion has to be, I've got this, I need something to challenge this, and the friction to rub. Um, where could they go? Where could they start to look? I guess.
Yeah, I suppose the very first thing to do would be to get an understanding of what the sort of futures process is. And in the book that Theo and I put together, there was a very short chapter written by, again, Nick Bagmington, who I'd point you back to because he's someone that's come at this from an angle rather than coming it through the proper sanctioned channels to become a
Mm,
futurist with a capital F with a few credentials behind your name. In the chapter in our book, he lays out very simply what the sort of futurist process, how it plugs into the economy. Because if you want to earn a living doing these sorts of things, you have to understand how the world works, how the business models work. And essentially, you can be doing signal scanning, trend research. There's many people that make money doing trend research reports, all the rest of it. And then you can do more of the sort of interactive workshopping and strategy kind of space too. He's also written another book called Facing Our Futures. It's a great place to give you an introduction to how futurists think. So I would familiarize myself with something like that. There's many other books that have been written about what futurists do and why you need a futurist. They don't tend to sell too well, other than to people who want to become futurists. But there's a lot of people who want to do that. So familiarize yourself with the industry there. But the most important thing you can do is to develop for yourself a good general knowledge and to start to see how things connect together. That's why I do say my sort of intellectual history has been largely formed by Terry Pratchett. And I know he's a writer of science fiction novels. You might not be your cup of tea, all the rest of it. But what he is absolutely brilliant at is threading Easter eggs, not just through the continuity of his various very eclectic novels, but also dropping Easter eggs as to the great amount of research he did in terms of history, fiction, politics, economics, and the ability to, when you start to read books like that, where you start to see how things can be connected, that is the critical skill you need. And the only way you're going to get that is by exposing yourself to more information. And I would encourage people that the best way to get information into your brain is still through actually reading. You won't be able to listen to podcasts or watch webcasts as quickly as you'll be able to read to absorb information. And it's also critical that you actually are absorbing that information, that you're not just storing it on a third-party disk, which is why using ChatGPT to pull out signals and to say, give me a trend report that maps all the connections between anything that's going on in, say, with, say, Ozempic in the economy,
Mm,
it's going to give you a much shallower understanding of what's going on than if you have some actual knowledge upon which to thread it. And quite frankly, you're not going to have a place in this world if you are only relying on tools that have been already abstracted and digitized and flattened into AI machines. Then you might as well just cut out the middleman, which would be in our case, me or you, if you don't have anything actual to add as a human being or as a connector of dots. And there are so
mm.
many dots that have not been connected through the internet yet, which means they cannot be used by these artificially intelligent tools, which is where you're going to actually start to add value. So get interested in everything. That would be the sort of short advice. Or if you're taking it a bit more seriously, if you want to be an academic, go spend the money, do the degree. They're all great universities, they're all very expensive ones, all business schools, and read what other people in the future space have been doing. It's also interesting to read the sort of older futurists. This is a new career path, only ready since the 1960s. The likes of Elvin Toffer, the likes of Faith Popcorn, read their early work, see where the sorts of ideas and where the career journey started, and then decide what you want to map out for yourself. If you want to be a world changer or if you want to be a facilitator or a researcher, those are essentially your kind of three paths that you can choose to go down, or a little bit of all of them, if that's your
Nice.
cup of tea.
It's fascinating. You mentioned Terry Pratchett a lot. I mentioned Roald Dahl a lot
Oh,
in
yes.
my writing. It's like the creative side of that is just amazing. I guess there's something around. I kind of want to get into the workspace a little bit, but just before I get there, there's I use a tool. I think technology is the enabler, right? Like it enables us, but it's not the thinker for us. But I use something called Obsidian. Have you come across this at all? Right, which is basically like a second brain. So all your reading you put in there, and you start to see patterns in your thinking, and it connects dots for like to then start stimulating your own thinking. It's not AI, it's nothing like that. It's just a way in
Mm.
order to connect dots in a way where you can start to help you see your patterns or patterns what you didn't actually see. It's a really cool tool. But there's something on your Substack which you talked about a little bit. I think it might have been last week, maybe. Oh, yeah, it must have been last week. Around skills and the kind of factor of this kind of skill passes. Could you share a little bit more about that? Because I think you mentioned, I think it was Australia. But yeah, share a little bit about kind of what you're seeing there.
Well, this is not a particularly new idea, but it's now getting interesting because we also have a lot of governments that are interested in CBDCs at the moment and in digitizing identity, like formally. The difference between having an identity card and having a credit card to going towards digitized forms of identity mean that you're going to be able to connect your official credentials, your official degrees, certificates, skills, experience in a way that actually gives you the ability to prove that to other people. Again, there's a whole lot of challenges as to whether what gets put into that identity, which is linked to your official identity, is actually accurate, whether you could have cheated to get in there, or if you could have things attributed to yourself that are not actually things that you've done or said before. These systems can be failable when it comes to the on-ramps and off-ramps. Those are sort of the ethical questions behind it. But in essence, these things have already been around. Like the EU already has like a digital skills passport, I think they call it, or very similar technologies that allow workers who have had like a certain degree of experience, say that electricians or whatever, supports it from the UK to go work in Germany and still have the same trade union level. So it kind of makes them sort of skills, just skills fungible, as they call it in sort of a financial terms, and that they can be sort of made comparable, apples to apples, sort of does that equation for you, but it's still attached to your personal identity. So it's just another degree of sort of proof, but it is becoming interesting in that your digital identity is making explicit the idea that all data is credit data, and that your skills and experience that are attached to your skills pass are essentially kind of like having credit in your credit card, not just cash credit, but it can be translated into cash because it's sort of a license to earn a certain amount of money, and it proves your sort of status on the career ladder. So that's kind of where we headed there, where all your credit, your financial credit, your social credit in terms of like your Uber score, how nice you are at drivers, and your credentials all sort of linked to your identity and used as kind of your master key to unlock good services and opportunities in society.
It's fascinating, right? Because then you start to look at how China are doing it. Like everything's done for, is it WeChat? WeChat, I want to say, um, and how that kind of that whole thing becomes your marketplace, who you are, what your rating is, and I think this is what probably Elon Musk is trying to do with Twitter now, right? He's trying to create a version of that. Um, but there's something which I find quite interesting. I was having this conversation with, actually, shout out to Nikki Holland, I think it was a few years back. She was launching a platform, and we talked about this, like that opportunity to be able to transfer around. But it's gonna be for the few, I think, initially, like it always is, right? Because I guess there's lots of companies who I've worked with in the past where I'm like, wow, they want this, but yet they haven't even brought in like a Microsoft Teams because that's just too much red tape to even get through the door. But then this is so I think there's something around that kind of the time it takes for that infrastructure to support that. Is that fair?
Kind of, but these things can take place quite slowly and then quite suddenly. I think the Indian Aadhaar case study is the best one to look at there, how quickly India was able to roll that out with their massive, now world biggest population, and how quickly they were able to digitize, connecting both currency and identity. Does say that these things can be rolled out quite quickly, especially by like diktat, right? So it's
Mm.
more a case of how much regulation you have going on that slows these things down. But I think they'll be rolled out quite quickly, and I think people might be surprised at how quickly they are done and can be implemented with just a very few sort of strikes of the legislator's pen, right? And I think we'll also be surprised at how globally coordinated the rollout is, especially across the West. So we can also see the online safety bills as being kind of a precursor here. It doesn't seem like it's connected, but it all does become connected because these are questions fundamentally around encryption, around what should be allowed to remain secret. Again, coming back to the earlier conversations today, and what should be matters of public record. Again, the sort of critical trade offs there as to how much information other people should get to know about you and how much you should be able to withhold from anyone and from everyone. Of course, there's also the other sort of conversations around who should be able to access what types of information and whether you should be able to stop or prevent people from accessing even verified information attached to your identity, which is where a lot of the sort of self-sovereignty conversations come in. But that's getting a bit technical.
Mm. Yeah, and I'm personally thinking we need a part two for this. But anyway, I guess there's other bit as well which I read on your kind of your daily signals, and there's something around paid not to work, which I found fascinating. And it feels like you was telling me, right? But when you're telling your subscribers and whatnot, this idea of kind of holding the talent and paying them not to do something. Maybe share a little bit about that because I think not many people may have come across that.
Yeah, we call this the human Pokemoning trend, which is essentially where quite wealthy companies, often in like sectors like the consultancy sector or the IT sector, where the competition for talent is quite fierce, will lock up talent either through sort of graduate schemes or through sort of headhunting critical talent, get them onto the payroll. So essentially, the competition can't access that talent, but they might not actually have a productive role for that talent. So either they get put them into like a really qualified, say, an economics PhD, and they'll put them into like writing blog posts for like the company's Twitter, for example. So they take an overqualified person and then essentially give them kind of like a bullshit job in terms of David Graeber's way of looking at bullshit jobs being jobs that don't need to exist and don't add value, but still sort of retaining that talent. Or they'll kind of almost warehouse that talent, not give them anything to do, with the expectation that when the economy grows, they'll be able to tap into that pool of talent. It's like it's almost a case of there's a risk of letting that talent go, that you won't be able to hire them again when there are economic upturns. But it's a huge waste of human capital, a huge waste of shareholder value, but it could be seen as a defensive move, right? Like sort of
Mm.
hoarding potential energy rather than actually using kinetic energy. It's one of those weird things we saw. We certainly not seeing as much of it this year, but in the sort of big tech boom when people were hiring and all those people getting massive tech jobs, huge salaries out the gate, that was very much part of this. It's when there's excess liquidity in the market, then people will tend to sort of overinvest in stockpiling goods and services and talent, right?
Mm. I find it just fascinating, and for both the good and the not so good reasons. Because a lot of my work is helping companies, whether I'm on fixed term contracts or whatever, is like, actually, how do we design a better workplace experience? How do we attract the talent? How do you compete and get the new talent before anyone else does? And I think in one respect, I like the idea of that. Actually, what can we do to attract the talent when we can't hire them or as such? But then I'm also like, but what is the impact? What is the second order impact of what that's having? Because then they're potentially de-skilling, right? Over time, they're just losing the skill because they're not actually sharpening it. But I have two more questions. Two more questions. Um, I guess the next question I have is, if you've got a billboard, okay, and outside the billboard's outside a stadium of million of people, and everyone coming out of that stadium's going to see that billboard, okay? The people in there are fellow futurists, if you like. What's a message you'd put on that billboard for a million people to see?
It's up to you what comes next. Like that, it's that simple.
Okay, okay, it's quite a nice one. Quite a nice one. I guess the last one is, what is the future of a workplace for you? How do you see it? I know this is a bold, big question, but what do you see? What do you not predict? But I guess, yeah, what's the trend you're picking up on now in the future of a workplace as we
I
know it?
think the big shift that we're really starting to see is going to continue is the shift from incomes based remuneration to outcomes based remuneration. So, in other words, it's a stripping back of that fourth wall. That illusion of security is going to be replaced by a call to accountability, because the sort of the 7 fat years are kind of over at the moment. The 7 lean years that are staring us in the face that we sort of can kick down the road with quantitative easing and modern monetary theory and all that will catch up with us at some point, which means that companies will be looking to reduce their human Pokemon stockpiles and make sure that people are actually adding value. There's only so many lazy girl minimum effort Monday TikToks that the sort of whole shareholder class will bear, which is both good and bad. It depends on how confident you are that you're actually adding value. The question of value is going to come up a lot when it comes to human resources, and also, unfortunately, for citizen resources in terms of the human resources of the state too. So questions around value, return on human capital will become probably the big questions going forward. And if you are great, you're going to be able to write your own checks and choose your own locations. Those sorts of things become privileges of those who are able to justify outcomes based remuneration.
Cool, cool. Thank you. Right at the start, I asked you a question. If you were braver, what would you be doing with your life? What's the answer to that question?
If I was braver, I'd probably run further away. I'd have joined the Red Cross, like run off somewhere.
Okay.
I'm not brave enough to leave behind my creature comforts. Not quite yet.
Okay, nice. And at the start, you said when you grew up, you wanted to be a rock star or a spy. As you know, clearly through this whole conversation, we never really truly stop growing and growing up. So, if I was to ask that question now, what would you want to be when you grow up? What would you say now?
I don't have any expectations anymore. I think we spoke a bit earlier about sort of the millennial generation and the problem with expectations. I think that's the whole point now is to learn, especially as it gets more advanced in age, learn not to expect too much, right? Or to expect too specifically, not to expect too much. You should expect things are going to get better and invest in that, as I said before, but not to expect too specifically. I think that that's probably the mistake I made before, and that's not necessarily great motivational speaker advice. Lots of people will tell you that you're much more likely to succeed if you have very specific goals ahead. But I think it's also a way to have a much less happy and balanced life is to be more specific about what you want rather than being open to seeing what the most exciting adventure can unfold given your choices on our choose your own adventure, whatever rolls over on the page that you get the next day.
Nice, nice. Thank you. So Roman, there's going to be lots and lots of people who's going to be listening to this going, how the hell do I kind of stay on track with this? Where can I go to follow Bronwyn? Like, yeah, where can people find you? Where can they stay up to date with what you're doing and what you're sharing?
Sure, you can find me on LinkedIn. I'm just like / Bronwyn Williams. Same on Twitter, or the platform formerly known as Twitter, now X, at Bronwyn Williams. Otherwise, my company is Flux Trends. Flux, as in the world is in constant change, trends.com. You can find what we're up to over there.
Awesome. Bronwyn, this has been an absolute pleasure. Thank you so much for coming on the show.
Thank you.